Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. We are now going to start, unfortunately, the concluding panel of the fourth annual Slamani Forum, which will be a regional topic. So if everyone could please take their seats and make sure they have translation devices, turn off your own Wi-Fi, etc. Thank you. We're going to start the final panel. So if everyone could make their way to their seats, thank you.
Welcome everybody to, as you heard from Christine, the last panel. Now you have to understand this panel was supposed to start at 2 and end at 3:30. It is 3:30 now, so you can all go home. And we're done. No. So this panel is essentially looking at turmoil and disorder, whether we have a new Sykes-Picot in the making. Look, May 17 is the 100th anniversary of Sykes-Picot. An agreement that, at least in this region, will live and still lives in infamy. Yet, when you look at the map that Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot's designed at the time, that map has some correlation with what happened later on, but it's not exactly the same. Yet, Sykes-Picot is very much in everybody's mind, and now, 5 years after the beginning of the Arab Spring, for the first time, people are now thinking about another Sykes-Picot. It's actually convenient that we're talking about it 100 years later, because it makes life easier if we do it every 100 years. 100 years from now, there'll be maybe Sykes-Picot 3, but so the point is that whether or not countries' borders change, and we heard yesterday night from Tom Friedman that those countries that have straight line boundaries, those that were drawn with a ruler, are the ones most in danger of changing. But even if the boundaries don't change, what is very clear is that the old state structures are no longer there to be reconstructed, that something new will have to be built in the region. And we have 5 wonderful panelists, and what we are going to do today is we're going to start with the international, with the broad outlook, with Robin Wright, and I will introduce each one in a minute, and then we'll go and look at what the Saudis and the Gulf countries want in terms of looking at the future of Iraq, the future of Syria, the future of the region if you want. What is it that they want? And what is it that they're ready for in terms of what are they, in case things don't go the way they want, what is it they expect and how do they get ready for it? And after Saudi Arabia and Turkey, we will look at Iraq itself and how the Iraqis see themselves. And finally, going into the drilling down, if you want, we're going to look at how the Kurds see each other. So we'll start with Robin Wright. And I should say that in 2013, Robin published an article in the New York Times in which the subtitle was How 5 Countries Became 14. And it turned out to be the 7th most read article that year, which basically she talked about the changing boundaries of the region. In some ways, she was way ahead of everybody else on this issue. So Robin who's now at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I should say, since I'm also, running the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, she's at the Woodrow Wilson Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And then we'll go to Abdulaziz Steger, who's the chairman of the Gulf Research Center. And then we'll go to Shaban Kardash, the director of OSAM, which is a think tank on the Middle East in Ankara. Then we'll do Haidar Al-Khoy. He's a fellow at the Chatham House, but most importantly, like me, he's a board member of AUIS. And that's his real attribute. And finally, we'll go with Kawa Hassan, who is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the East-West Institute, and he's also a non-resident scholar at Carnegie's Middle East Center in Beirut. So without much ado, Robin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Henri, and thank you, Barham, for organizing this extraordinary conference. It's been a great pleasure. We end on the most controversial subject in many ways. Let me just put it in global context. We talk so much about the breakup and the future of the Middle East, when in fact this has really been the trend of my lifetime. I was born in 1948, at the time the UN was formed, and there were 57 members. Today we have over 190. In many ways, the 21st century is going to be the story of the regrouping. We've seen it already in other parts of the world. The Middle East is not an exception, whether it's the discordant communities of Yugoslavia breaking up or the dysfunctional ideological groupings in the Soviet Union. So the Middle East is not an exception, but of course you are in many ways part of the perfect storm. Now, I first landed in the Middle East on October 6, 1973, which was the day the Fourth Middle East War broke out. And I, for most of that time, rejected the idea of the breakup of the Middle East. There were map after map after map proposing the breakup. I lived in Beirut for 5 years, and there was a lot of talk during the Civil War about whether Lebanon was going to implode, whether it was breaking up as a country or being reabsorbed by Syria. I, again, never believed that was going to happen. But I began to change my mind when I spent a year in the Middle East for a book I wrote called Rock the Casbah, taking a look at this extraordinary phenomena of 2011 and beginning to understand the evolution, of the impact of the Arab Spring in defining what people wanted. So I started asking people not just what they wanted immediately, but what their region would look like. And people started talking about the different ways of identifying their goals. And I have to give credit to Abdulaziz Sager because he was the last person I talked to, and in many ways the person I spent the most time with. And I at one point suggested we do this piece together. And he said it was too hot to handle, and he rejected the idea, but I have to give him credit for for inspiring me on many of the issues. So obviously, I think there are 6 things I think that have contributed to where we are today. One, obviously, is as I said, the Arab Spring. That sense of not just that people deserved rights, but it was for the first time we understood that a generation had embraced the idea of diversity. That we saw that reflected in what had transpired between the rise of Al Jazeera as the first television station to circumvent state control, to a point that you had 500 independent satellite television stations in the Middle East. And suddenly there was no one truth, there was no one nationalism, whether it was in politics, in religion, that people understood whether it was the diversity of political ideas, the talk shows, the way you covered the news, the way you looked at events, the talk shows, the soap operas, that there was just a diversity of life. And that then exposed whether it was the faux nationalisms that had bonded people, the ideologies, the vacuous ideologies that had used repression to keep people together. And we have crossed a threshold at this point that there is no going back from that wave of rights, that people believe they have a stake in their future. The problem is that's only half of any system that involves political participation, because we saw the rise of communityism in lieu of nationalism. And that then created, while it wanted an alternative, it exposed the lack of a sense of common good. The communityism was looking at your local, whether it's your clan, your tribe, your sect, your ethnicity, your nationality, as the means to both protect and project political power. And because there was no sense of common good, that then began to lead people to look at their own communities as the way to protect their future. So the rise of communityism was then militarized or securitized with the civil war in Syria. where the issues of political survival and political future were replaced by existential issues of physical survival. It changed the ability to find alternatives. It deepened and, of course, spilled over, as Syria is the strategic center of the region, on communities across the region. So you have the political devolution, you have the militarization of the community alternative that then begins to define the future. And then you get to the point that we are now a decade into that political process. And the great danger is that we've gotten to a point where it's not just groups fighting each other in Iraq that lead to the collapse of a state. The real danger is that we have passed so much time and that the problems are so deep that whether it's the economic morass, the political impasse, or the fact that the social contract is no longer deliverable, that it's not an issue of states breaking up because of the clashes among militias or political groups. It's the fact that the state is no longer sustainable, that the traditional political actors have been replaced by the community leaders. And in most cases, those are not elected, not reflecting anything more than community interests. Now, much of this is kind of obvious. I'm trying to talk through how we've gotten to this point. But I think we're actually entering into a whole new round of challenges to states we expected, because they continue to be autocratic, because they have had resources, that may also join those nations of that category of vulnerable states. And I include Saudi Arabia in that process. I think we tend to be duped by whether it's high-rise structures or 8-lane and 16-lane highways, that tribalism today in Saudi Arabia is deep as it's has been since the third iteration of the state. That it, because of its involvement in Yemen, because of its overextended economically, because it's in transition politically, that there are a lot of reasons that even a country like Saudi Arabia is vulnerable to this trend. And one of the things that struck me when I was asking people what the map of the Middle East would look like in the future, that many of the states were obvious. And the number of people who said to me, well, why aren't you including Saudi Arabia in this list? So I decided, okay, I'll start asking. And I was stunned the fact that not a single Saudi rejected the idea, including 2 members of the royal family. Now, we promised to be short, so let me just say, I tend to think that there is a positive side, and that is, just as we see the Europeans come together in the European Union, that one of the trends of the 21st century as we move to globalization will be the creation of regional blocs. The region already has some, whether it's the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Maghreb Union, ECHO, which is an environmental grouping, that there is a sense that to survive, there have to be regional alliances. And that down the road, I think, is the hope of the region. There's no question in my mind that Kurdistan is going to, at some point in the not too distant future, be its own entity. Whether it's through decentralization, hard partition, independence, that it will be a separate entity. But I also think that Kurdistan will depend, for a lot of obvious reasons, whether it's geography, its economy, its lifeline literally through pipelines, that it has to be part of a larger grouping. The problem is we are likely to go through a lot of discord, a lot of internal conflicts, a lot of the deterioration of political systems, and particularly in the absence of viable alternatives, with the most interesting actors being too young, too inexperienced, without the resources, the networks, the parties to create viable alternatives. So this is obviously going to be a period of, I think, probably unprecedented conflict in the last 100 years in this region. But I also think that we're beginning to see the trend of the 21st century is finding groups with which you can cooperate in finding solutions and finding a viability. But it's just, it's not visible yet. And with that, I'll leave it.
Thank you. Abdulaziz.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بداية أود أن أعرب عن عميق الشكر والتقدير إلى معالي الدكتور برهم صالح وحرمه المصون وكافة المساهمين في تنظيم هذا المؤتمر وهذا اللقاء الجميل، والذي تمنيت أن أحضره في السنوات السابقة، ولكن مع الأسف.
Do we have translation? Can people hear?
If you prefer to speak in English, I can do that.
Yeah.
So majority in English?
Yes. When
Okay. Then I'll turn it into English. Kurdish لا يعني أقصد the language ما أقصد You speak in Arabic also?
No, I had one.
طيب. أول زيارة لي للسليمانية كانت عام 1980 ميلادي، وهذه الزيارة الثانية، فقبل 36 عاما زرت السليمانية، وها أنا اليوم سعيد بهذه الدعوة الكريمة لأكون بين إخواني وأخواتي من كردستان العراق، فتحية حب لهذا الشعب العريق العظيم، الشعب الكردي. بداية سايس بيكو الاتفاقية قبل 100 عام كانت هنالك ظروف خاصة فرضت هذه الاتفاقية. كان الصراع بين الإمبراطورية العثمانية والإمبراطورية البريطانية على أوجه. نحن في مركز الخليج للأبحاث أنتجنا فيلما وثائقيا اسمه وعود وغدر Promises and Betrayals. ما هي الوعود التي وعدتها بريطانيا في بداية القرن، وهل أوفت بها أو لم توفي بها؟ بريطانيا وعدت بوطن عربي للشريف، وأعطت بالفور ديكلاريشن، ووعدت بسايس بيكو، فكانت هذه الوعود مهمة أصدرتها، ووعدت القيصر، وعدت البلاشفة، ووجدنا وثيقة مهمة وقعها وزير الخارجية البريطاني في ذلك الوقت يقول: لم نكن نقصد أن نوفي بأي من هذه الوعود. We have never intended to deliver any one of these promises. فهذه قضية مهمة وتاريخية. الفيلم الوثائقي موجود وسبق أن عرض على يمكن أكثر من 50 محطة، وأنا اهتميت به اهتمام شخصي كبير، وأنتج في بريطانيا وجمعت له مواد أساسية كثير مهم جدا. أنا أعرف موقف إخواني في كردستان العراق أنهم لا يحبون سايس بيكو لأنه تجاهل حقوق الشعب الكردي، فيعني من الناحية هذه أنا أتفهم هذا الجانب. لكن دعونا نمر على بعض النقاط الأساسية التي تفرض نفسها في الوقت الحالي. أولاً، الطرق التقليدية التي كانت متاحة في حل الأزمات والإشكاليات سواء السياسية أو العسكرية أو الاقتصادية لم تعد قائمة أو لم تعد قادرة على إنهاء هذه الإشكاليات وهذه القضايا المهمة في وقتنا الحاضر. في السابق يمكن كان لها دور، لكن الآن مع الأسف نحن وجدنا وجربنا هذه الحلول كلها لم يعد لها ذلك. النقطة الثانية والمهمة أن الأمم المتحدة بالرغم من قراراتها التي تصدر تحت البند السابع لا تنفذ وليس لها قيمة في بعض الأحيان، فلذلك فقدت الأمم المتحدة قوتها في فرض الحلول التي كانت تريدها. هذا أوجد لنا حالة مهمة في المنطقة قبل أن نتحدث عن سايس بيكو من ناحية التقسيم أهميته أو عدم أو إشكالياته، ولكن أوجد لنا هذا الوضع حروب أهلية وصراعات مسلحة كثيرة في المنطقة. النقطة الثانية، وهذا طبعا مثالها ليبيا واليمن وسوريا وخلاف الدول التي عانت من هذه الإشكالية، أوجد لنا جماعات مسلحة غير حكومية تلعب دور في انهيار الدولة وتنمو في دولة منهارة، بمعنى أن الميليشيا والجماعات المسلحة تمارس 3 أنواع. لها ميليشيات مسلحة تقوم بجريمة منظمة وتشارك في العمل السياسي في الحكومات، فهذا أيضا وضع جديد أفرز لنا بسبب الوضع الحالي اللي نحن موجودين فيه. أيضا هنالك صراع طائفي نعاني منه في المنطقة. في السابق لم يكن الصراع الطائفي موجود بهذا الشكل وبهذا الحجم، أما الآن فإن هنالك صراع طائفي مهم يدور في المنطقة. هنالك دول تعاني من أزمات أمنية، الأردن وتونس ومصر تعاني من أزمات بسبب الجوار الذي مرادف لها، فيعني تعاني من إشكاليات كبيرة في هذا الجانب. الانترناشنال اكترز، اللاعبين الدوليين، الدور الأمريكي في سوريا كان تعيس، وهو الذي سمح بتمدد الأزمة بهذا الشكل بسبب السياسات والخطوط الحمراء التي وضعت ولم يتم الوفاء بها، فاستمر الوضع في سوريا إلى ما نحن عليه، ودخلنا السنة السادسة الآن في هذا الجانب. أيضا الدور الروسي استغل الضعف الأمريكي فتواجد في سوريا ودخل كدولة محتلة بقوات عسكرية. نحن رحبنا بالقرار من يومين الذي قال أنهم سوف يسحبوا يعني جزء كبير من قواتهم، ولكن لا نعلم بعد كم حجم هذه القوات، إلى أي مدى، أين سوف يظل التواجد السوري، وتبعاته بالتأكيد نستطيع أن نتكلم عنها. هنالك استغلال دول إقليمية للحالة، بمعنى حالة الانفلات الأمني وحالة التدهور اللي موجودة سمحت لدول إقليمية أن تلعب دور أكبر من دورها السابق، ولم يعد هنالك الحفاظ على الوضع السابق كما كان في نهاية. انهيار أسعار النفط له تأثير سلبي جدا. لما كانت أسعار النفط جيدة كان هنالك إمكانية للدول أن تساهم وأن تساعد في البناء وفي التنمية. نحن اليوم الصباح استمعنا للجلسة الخاصة بالاقتصاد العراقي وما يعانيه الاقتصاد العراقي، وهو ليس فقط على العراق ولكن على معظم الدول النفطية التي اعتمدت على النفط كمصدر أساسي لدخلها، كيف تعاني من هذا الجانب. فأيضا تدهور أسعار النفط له تأثير على الأمن والاستقرار وعلى وضع الدول في المنطقة بشكل عام. توسع أعمال الجماعات الإرهابية. الجماعات الإرهابية توسعت في أعمالها، لم تعد تقتصر على حدودنا، ولكن صدرت إلى باريس وإلى بلجيكا وإلى مناطق أخرى وإلى ألمانيا وإلى عمليات ثانية، فأصبحت منطقة حاضنة لكثير من قضايا الإرهاب وخرجت من حدودها. النقطة الأخرى والمهمة هي بالفعل السياسة التي تبناها الرئيس الأمريكي منذ مقدمه إلى السلطة على منطقتنا في الشرق الأوسط. لم تكن سياسة جيدة أو حكيمة، أدخلتنا في إشكاليات، هنالك ضعف، هنالك وهن، وهنالك تراجع، هنالك تردد في بعض المواقف، سببت كثير من إشكاليات لنا في هذا الجانب، ولم تحسم كثير من الأمور. نتعامل مع المزاجية في بعض الأحيان، وفي بعض الأحيان مع معايير مزدوجة نتعامل معها بسبب السياسة الأمريكية، ولكن لها تأثير وتأثيرها واضح وبشكل أساسي في هذا الجانب. الآن حينما نأتي إلى سلبيات، حينما نتحدث عن الفيدرالية أو عن نيو سايز بيكو أو كما يسمى، بالنسبة للمنظور الغربي كندا وأمريكا ليست مثال بالنسبة لنا. بالنسبة لنا هنا التقسيم يتم على أساس طائفي أو عرقي. الدستور العراقي يتحدث عن شيعة وسنة وأكراد، لم يتحدث عن عرب وأكراد، لم يتحدث عن سنة وشيعة، وإنما يتحدث عن ثلاثية. فهنا أي محاولات في المستقبل في هذا الجانب هي تعني أن التقسيم ليس ولايات أمريكية أو ولايات كندية، ولكنه يتم على أساس إما البعد الطائفي أو البعد العرقي الذي يتم. هذا يعني أنه هل الحالة السياسية الأمنية التي نعيشها الآن هي السبب في التفكير الجاد في قضية مستقبل أو سايس بيكو جديد وإعادة رسم الخارطة وإعادة التقسيمات على أسس طائفية وكذا؟ السؤال يحتاج إلى بحث مهم جدا، لأنه الجواب الموازي، هل لو تغيرت هذه الحالة، هل لو شعر الأكراد بأن حقوقهم مصانة وأن منطقتهم لها حصتها من التنمية بشكل جيد وأن الوظائف متاحة لهم حسب التعداد والنسب السكانية والكفاءات وكذا، هل سوف يظل المطالبة بالاستقلال قائمة، أو أنهم يرون أنفسهم أمام الدولة العراقية الموحدة بالكيان المنطقي بالنسبة لهم، بالاستقلالية في الحكم الذاتي هي كافية؟ لأنه قد تكون كردستان ضمن الإطار العراقي الموحد أقوى من كردستان مستقلة، لأنها مجاورة لدول كبرى لها أطماع مستقبلية قد تكون لا تستطيع أن يعني small country vis-a-vis big country، الدولة الصغيرة مقابل الدولة الكبيرة، وتظل هذه الأطماع تاريخية، ومن يقرأ التاريخ ويجي فيه حتكون موجودة. ولكن من يقرر هو الشعب الكردي، من يحدد هذا الجانب هو الشعب الكردي والإرادة الكردية، وهو أعلم بكيف يختار. ولكن سؤالي أنا كان لو تغير هذا الوضع، هل هذا سوف يسمح بإعادة التفكير والنظرة المختلفة؟ النقطة الثانية، التقسيم سوف يقود إلى المزيد من الصراع والمشاكل والتهديدات، لأنه أيضا في قضايا كثير ذات علاقة، هنالك الموارد وهنالك الأرض وهنالك الثروات وهنالك الحدود، كثير من القضايا سوف تطرح قضايا كثير. ونحن نعلم حتى في دول الخليج أخذنا سنوات طويلة إلى أن رسمنا الحدود فيما بيننا، ونحن متقاربين في الأنظمة وفي الطبائع وفي الصحراء وفي كذا، أخذنا سنوات طويلة. هل التقسيم هذا أو إعادة رسم الخارطة سوف يخلق الكثير من هذه الإشكاليات؟ أيضا سؤال يطرح نفسه ومهم أن يكون التفكير فيه. التقسيم أيضا والتوزيع أو إعادة رسم الخارطة وإعادة سايس بيكو سوف يسمح للقوى الخارجية بالتدخل بسبب الصراعات، فتأتي دولة معينة لتدعم هذه الطائفة على هذه الطائفة، فلا يعني أن إعادة رسم الخريطة سوف توفر مناخا آمنا مستقرا للمنطقة، وإنما سوف تؤجج الكثير من الصراعات التي يمكن أن تكون. أيضا سوف يكون هنالك حالة من الفوضى، وهذه حالة الفوضى راح يكون لها دور كبير ومهمة كبيرة. إذا أنا سمح لي الوقت بدقيقة، أنا حاولت أن أفكر ما هو شكل العراق الذي نتطلع إليه كأخوانكم في الخليج، محبين لهذا البلد ولهذا الشعب، ونحترم كل الطوائف الموجودة في العراق ونقدرها ونكن لها كل التقدير والاحترام. يعني من وجهة نظري الشخصية أنا حينما يكون هنالك عراق موحد لا ينشر نموذج التقسيم والفصل وكذا، فبالتأكيد هذا نموذج جيد، لأنه بشكل عام دول الخليج ليست مع التقسيم، لا في ليبيا ولا في سوريا ولا في اليمن ولا في المناطق هذه. هي تريد كيانات عربية موحدة، بقدر ما يكون الكيان موحد بقدر ما يكون أمنا واستقرارا بالنسبة للمنطقة. ولكن هذه وجهات نظر قابلة للنقاش والحوار. على كل، النقطة الثانية هو عراق قوي يحفظ التوازن الإقليمي. كلما كان هنالك عراق قوي ومجهز بالتجهيز اللازم هو أفضل من صالحنا في المنطقة بشكل كبير، لأنه سوف يلعب دوره الرئيسي. كلما كان العراق لا ينشر الطائفية، نحن لا نريد عراق ينشر الطائفية ولا نريد عراق أن يعمق هذا البعد من الطائفي. هنالك أخطاء من جميع الأطراف، من السنة هنالك أخطاء، من الشيعة هنالك أخطاء، من كل الأطراف هنالك أخطاء ارتكبت، ولكن الأمل أن لا يكون هنالك عراق يعمق وينشر هذه الطائفية، لأنه لو صارت هنالك لا سمح الله حرب طائفية سوف تبدأ من حدود إيران إلى آخر الدول العربية. نريد عراق مستقر وآمن لا يسمح بالفوضى الأمنية، لأن كل ما كان هنالك عراق مستقر وآمن لا يسمح بالفوضى الأمنية كلما كان من صالح كل المنطقة ويدعم كل دول الخليج. العراق المستقل الذي لا يسمح بالنفوذ الخارجي لديه، لا من السعودية ولا من تركيا ولا من غير دولة شكل. نريد عراق له استقلاله في حكمه، في شعبه، في قراراته، في مصيره. كل ما كان هذا القرار بيد العراقيين أنفسهم واتفقت القوى السياسية والنخب السياسية العراقية. أنا أتذكر في مركز الخليج للأبحاث في عام 2003 أول مؤتمر عملناه فيها هو العراق ودول الجوار، وأرسلت طائرة روسية في ذلك الوقت جمعت كثير من النخب والإخوة العراقيين الأفاضل من الأكراد والسنة والشيعة، وجينا واجتمعنا في الشارقة، أتذكر كان اجتماعنا وطرحنا نقاش كيف نرى، وهذا كلام في 2003. الآن بعد 13 سنة أيضا نعيد نفس الطرح والجانب. فأيضا عراق مستقل لا يسمح بالتدخل ولا الاستقطابات، راح يكون من صالح كل المنطقة. العراق دولة مؤسس في الجامعة العربية ولها وزنها ولها تأثيرها الكبير. يجب أن لا يخرج العراق عن هذا المحيط العربي، مع كل تقديرنا واحترامنا ومحبتنا للشعب الكردي والإقليم كردستان ولأهلنا فيه ولمواقفنا التي نحب فيها ونقدر فيها. أنتم ما تتخيلوا قديش إحنا أخوانكم في الخليج نقدر إيواءكم لإخوانكم السنة العراقيين والشيعة أيضا العراقيين الذين جاءوا إلى كردستان واحتموا فيكم وحميتوهم وآويتوهم وساعدتوهم وأكرمتوهم. هذه محل تقدير كبير بالنسبة لنا، لا يمكن أن ننسى لكم هذا الفضل وهذا الموقف. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Abdulaziz. I will have follow-up questions once we've gone through. So Shaban, you next, as the other big neighboring country.
Okay, thank you to the organizers for putting together this great audience. It has been my second year here. Also, I had a chance to attend the Erbil Forum the year before. It is good to see that the experts around the world are able to come together in this room, in these halls, to discuss the future of the region, especially in such a critical year. I will try to briefly share with you my own view about the future of the so-called Sykes-Picot order, because like here, also in Turkey, it has become part of the daily discussions on popular TV shows. In the evening, you keep hearing ordinary commentators talking about Sykes-Picot. It has become part of the daily language. And then I will also try to present my views about how Turkey has been affected by the recent developments, which make us question the future of Sykes-Picot. And maybe later we can expand on those. Briefly, when I look at these discussions, I think we can discuss the future of the regional order under 5 different dimensions. Definitely there are things that make us think that the Sykes-Picot order or the conventional order in the Middle East might have reached a dead end. There is a need for revision. Of course, as was also mentioned by previous speakers, most of the developments were triggered by the so-called Arab Spring, but it is hard to limit everything to the Arab Spring. So in my understanding, we can discuss those changes under 5 different dimensions. Firstly, we see that the borders in the region are challenged and questioned every day, and then it has moved beyond an academic debate. Now, even high-level policymakers keep uttering the words that refer to redrawing of the borders. But in my understanding, the borders have become part of discussions in 2 different senses. On the one hand, we see that the borders have lost their conventional meaning as markers of sovereignty of 2 states. So when we look at different internationally recognized borders, they do not function anymore because the state authority is not there to exercise borders. There are other competing authorities. On the other hand, there is the discussion about redrawing, dismemberment of existing states. So this is a major part of the discussions which make us think about the future of Sykes-Picot. The second dimension is what I call the erosion of national sovereignty and authority. This is also happening at the same time with the discussions about the borders affecting different countries at different degrees. That's why I think Turkey is itself also part of the same discussions. Although until now I refer to Turkey as an external actor, but Turkey is also integral to the very same processes because Turkey is also part of the same regional context. And Turkey is also affected by the erosion of sovereignty, erosion of the nation-state model in this context. A third dimension is the empowerment of the sub-state actors, identities and groups at the expense of, again, the national identity, national authority. So this is also happening at different degrees in different countries. And Turkey is also directly and indirectly affected by the very same process, especially the discussions about the future of the nation-state model. Turkey is the kind of textbook example of the national state experiment in the Middle East, is coming under pressure in this new juncture. There is a fourth dimension in the discussions about the Sykes-Picot order or Middle East order, which is what I call the vicious cycle between the socioeconomic underdevelopment and political underdevelopment. When we go back to the beginning of the Arab Spring that led to all the changes, as was also mentioned by Robin, it was a call for socioeconomic political reform coming from bottom up. But what we see now, those demands have not been fulfilled. Economically, socially, the region is not moving in a positive direction. The socioeconomic indicators are going in a negative direction. And it is also feeding the political underdevelopment. In that sense, why the people went on the streets in 2010, 2011, they are still there. The need for socioeconomic reform, the need for political reform, but those demands have not been fulfilled. In a sense, the potential for similar uprisings are still there, despite the fact that currently in Egypt we suspended it, in Iraq, in Syria, because of other reasons. The socioeconomic and political reforms are not on the agenda. The conflict has overtaken those discussions. But in the long run, eventually we will have to come back to, again, 2010, 2011, the very same demands that put the people on the streets. And in that context, it is very telling that right after the announcement of the ceasefire in Syria, people immediately started to protest, similar to 2011 dynamics. To me, it is important because, in a sense, it's a time bomb for the future of the region. As long as socioeconomic and political reform demands are not fulfilled, we cannot have durable, stable structures in the region. And in a sense, Turkey is also affected by the very same discussions. Turkey is also going through its own course in democratization process, although at a different stage. Turkey also still needs to continue with its own domestic socioeconomic and political transformation. But the very fact that in the region, socioeconomical political indicators are going in a worse direction, we did not develop a framework to manage regional transformation. I think we are now experiencing a negative spillover from the region into Turkey, Turkey's own democratization course, Turkey's own socioeconomic change is also negatively fed by the dynamics in the region. And there is a fifth and last dimension to the discussions about the Sykes-Picot or Middle East order, which is the lack of a region-wide collective security mechanism. I think this has been the big failure of the region to develop a genuine regional security mechanism to address a crisis as such. But conventionally, as the Sykes-Picot order also suggests, the security in the region used to be provided from outside. The extra-regional actors, the global actors, they were there in the creation of the regional order, modern Middle East, and traditionally they also used to provide security in the region. But now, in the recent juncture, we see that the extra-regional actors are less willing to play a role of security provider, and the lack of a regional framework has put the region in a very difficult situation. And I think because of that, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Egypt, in other places, we haven't been able to pacify, we haven't been able to put off the conflicts. Why is it important for Turkey? I think this is the gist of the recent Turkish foreign policy, at least before the onset of the Arab Spring, when we do remember the good old days, quote unquote, when the Turkish foreign policy used to be praised here in the KRG, in Iraq, in different parts of the world. At that time, Turkey was pursuing a very ambitious policy. It used to be defined differently by different commentators. But personally, I always used to argue that the Turkish foreign policy was an attempt in region building, an attempt in regionalization similar to what you also suggested. Turkey was seeking to achieve a degree of regional integration in the Middle East, in economic, in social, cultural, and most importantly, political and security sense. But with the onset of this Arab Spring and the recent discussions about the undoing of the regional order, we see that right now the main trends in the region are complete opposites of the key philosophical principles of Turkey's regional policy. Turkey used to aspire for regional integration, but in the region we see there is fragmentation at the very basic level, let alone regional integration. Turkey used to rely on economic soft power instruments, but today in the region, militarization is the case. In order to achieve your objectives, you have to use hard power, and this is where again Turkish foreign policy has come under a very enormous pressure. Again, Turkey, before the Arab Spring in the previous phase, used to call for moving beyond polarization, moving beyond sectarian differences. But again, the sectarian politics has become quite a defining characteristic of the region. And as a result, in the new phase where we discuss the future of the region, increasingly we see that the regional environment is against Turkey's normal understanding, ideal understanding of foreign policy. And as a result, Turkish foreign policy has been going through a very bumpy road recently. The discussions are there. Maybe we can expand on them later. But before I conclude, let me briefly underline 2 points. What we discuss about the future of the Sykes-Picot order or undoing of the old order. Personally, I think that we might be seeing rather reloading of the Sykes-Picot order than complete undoing of the Sykes-Picot order, especially the discussions about redrawing of the borders in the region. They create certain allergies on the part of the regional powers such as Turkey, such as Iran. And when you look at the recent visit of Turkish Prime Minister to Tehran, you see a kind of reflex to maintain the state structure. So it won't be easy to undo the Sykes-Picot order. But for Turkey, what we discussed so far, they have been affecting Turkey in two different senses. On the one hand, this new phase, the transformations in the regional order are a foreign policy challenge to Turkey, but on the other hand, they are a big domestic challenge to Turkey because Turkey itself is also part of the very same region. Turkey itself has the same lines of demarcation in its own domestic society, what we discuss about the ethnic polarization, what we discuss about the sectarian identities. They are also affecting Turkey's own domestic trajectory. But at the same time, in the recent phase, for Turkey, it has been a major foreign policy challenge because similar to Turkey's experience with northern Iraq in the wake of the Gulf War and 2003 American invasion of Iraq, in northern Syria, a similar story is emerging from the Turkish perspective. Now the region is full of failed states, where you see vacuums of authority in which security threats are emerging. Right now, I think in terms of the foreign policy angle, the biggest challenge to Turkey is to how to pacify the regional conflicts so that the security risks that are emerging from those vacuums in the region will not affect Turkey's own security. In that respect, when we look at the two recent attacks in Ankara in which PKK were implicated. In both cases, the planners, perpetrators, for some time did live in northern Syria in PYD-controlled areas. Then eventually they did carry out attacks inside Turkey. It is the same for other attacks carried out by ISIS. This new phase is showing that while Turkey traditionally used to see the Middle East as an area of opportunity to expand, it is economic interest, political interest. Now, from the Middle East, Turkey is importing security vulnerabilities. So in that sense, in the new phase, the first priority of Turkey is to pacify the conflicts so that it can undercut the security threats emerging from the Middle East. But while doing so, Turkey's own domestic discussions, Turkey's own democracy, Turkey's own political transition are also affected. I will stop here and we can come back to other dimensions, especially about Iraq and Syria, maybe in the second round.
Thank you, Shaban. Hi there.
It's a great pleasure to be back in Slimani and a privilege to be on this panel, so thank you for inviting me. And as an AUIS board member, this year the forum is extra special for me, and it's an honor for me to play, however small, a part in this incredible institution. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. AUIS, of course, has been blessed with a visionary and trailblazing leader, but it's also the staff, the students, the volunteers today who make all this happen. You are the unsung heroes of this place, and you should be immensely proud of what you have achieved so far. And I know we are in Kurdistan, but as an Iraqi, it makes me proud to know such an institution exists in this country. And in a vacuum, this university itself is impressive. But in the context of this conflict-ridden part of the world, and I know this has been said many times, but it's true, AUIS really is a beacon of hope for the next generation and an inspiration to us all. But now on to Sykes-Picot. Throughout the course of the 2 days, Sykes-Picot has been mentioned hundreds of times, and I think even more than the word ISIS, which is interesting. So I think it's fitting that this forum ends on a panel on turmoil and disorder. So the question is the Sykes-Picot over? I think the answer is both yes and no. If we want to be technical about it, the Sykes-Picot order was already over in 1932 when a League of Nations Commission defined and established the current Syria-Iraq border. So I don't think we'll see or witness new borders soon or in the near future, but we will see, and in fact are already seeing, a reordering of politics within the nation states, at least as far as Syria and Iraq are concerned. We'll see and are seeing more decentralization, local leaders having more power, some sort of workable federalism, but actually changing the borders in the 21st century is going to be much harder than drawing the borders was in the 20th century. So it won't be this time, it won't be men in suits in conference halls secretly drawing lines on a piece of paper. Today, it is going to be armed, angry young men on the ground who will draw the borders and draw the lines with blood. So the stakes are too high, and I think that's why the Sykes-Picot order, of course broadly defined, will endure. And I just have to, a slight disclaimer, I'm not saying this as an Iraqi nationalist who believes that somehow these colonial borders drawn up by the British and French are sacred and we must defend it to the last drop of our blood. But I say this as someone who just, a simple person who looks at a map and recognizes the very tough environment Iraq is in, who can see the plethora of armed groups active in Iraq and Syria, who of course are and will establish facts on the ground. But more importantly, the geopolitical realities I think we all have to face. Iraq is surrounded by larger, much more powerful countries who very blatantly and very openly use Iraq and Syria as a battlefield to settle their own scores. And you can imagine, or try to imagine, how peaceful Syria and Iraq would be today if Iran, Turkey, and Saudi had to fight each other directly. Of course, they would never risk their own security. And another big difference when we're talking about a new version of Sykes-Picot is to recognize that this time round, it's the people on the ground, the locals, who are going to matter much more than empire men. So the Middle East will continue to be an arena where powers will project their influence, that's for sure. But now it has a much more regional than international dimension. Of course, Russia and the US still matter a great deal, but Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia matter more. And gone are the days of the Gertrude Bells and Lawrence of Arabia's. Today, it's the Qasim Soleimanis who are shaping our future. And again, this is not to say the Brett McGurks of this world aren't relevant. They are relevant in this globalized world, but much less so. Another point I wanted to emphasize is whether this is said explicitly or implicitly, there tends to be an underlying good fences make good neighbors attitude to this desire to draw new borders. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Iraq was never and will never be easily dividable along ethno-sectarian lines. The disputed areas, the heavily mixed cities and provinces, the intermarriages and relations that bind us together as communities, these are all going to complicate the good fences argument. And if people think today that redefining the borders will end the bloodshed because Shias, Sunnis, Kurds are, just can't be civilized and live together, then I think they'll be in for a very rude awakening if Iraq is to be divided. I think we will witness bloodshed and ethnic cleansing on a biblical scale that will dwarf anything we've seen from Bashar al-Assad or Daesh. So coming to this question of what is it that Iraqis want? It's clear Iraqis do want stability regardless of their ethno-sectarian background, but their wishes and desires often come second to what others want from Iraq. And it's not just regional players who are complicating this equation. The regional players we heard today and yesterday, they all want territorial integrity of Iraq. They all want stability in Iraq. What they don't say, and this is true for the Turks, the Saudis, and the Iranians, what they don't tell you is that the stability they envision in Iraq is qualified stability. It's stability on their own terms. And for Iraqis, this translates to war and conflict. And I say it's not just the regional players, because I don't think we can ignore the United States, even if we acknowledge, and I should acknowledge, they matter less now. Half the time, the United States is at war with itself. Departmental rivalries, interagency battles. Now this leads to confusion within Washington, D.C., within the Beltway. And of course, it translates to confusion and chaos in the region itself. And Syria and Iraq, I think, are very good examples of this. Both Iraq in 2003 and Syria post-Arab Spring in 2011. So in Syria, you had, and still have, the CIA on its own adventure, arming rebel groups who we are told are moderate rebels, but moderate rebels who, for some reason or another, are fighting alongside Al-Qaeda or Daesh. They're no longer fighting alongside Daesh, but were when they were being armed by the Americans. And again, this is within DC. You have the Pentagon running its own adventure in Syria, spending $500 million funding, training, or equipping rebels who, once they crossed into Syria, disappeared or joined Al-Qaeda. And then, of course, more importantly, I think we have President Obama, who, as was clear from the recent article in the Atlantic, wants to wash his hands entirely of this region and thinks the only thing happening now is a transformation that is rooted back to conflict that date back millennia, which in itself is a subtly racist, orientalist interpretation of the Middle East. The reason I focus on America is because if America is confused about what America wants, then I think we can forgive or excuse the Iraqis for not being sure either. And again, coming back to Syria, I want to quote the same person, Vice President Biden, in 2012 and 2014. And this is important because it relates to Syria and the arming of rebels in Syria. In October 2012, the death toll in Syria was between 20 and 25,000. And Vice President Biden told the world publicly that the US is working hand in glove, those are his words, with its Turkish and Arab allies to make sure the right people are being armed. Fast forward to 2014, October, exactly 2 years after he said the US was working hand in glove with its allies. Now the death toll is well over 150,000. And the same Vice President Biden tells us the biggest problem in Syria was Turkey and its Arab allies, who were funding and arming Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and other Salafi jihadists. So the same allies the US was working hand in glove with in 2012, when they failed to achieve what they set out to achieve, suddenly it's their problem. And the United States can very conveniently say, well, it had nothing to do with us. It was the Turks and it was the Saudis, which I think is very naked and transparent deflection. And US policy on the Kurds, I think, is also very confusing. And again, this comes back to Sykes-Picot. Or Sykes-Picot in a broad sense, because the Turkey-Syria border wasn't a Sykes-Picot arrangement. But the Turkey-Syria border, on one side, the Kurds, we are told, are terrorists. And we, the international community, have to stand with our NATO ally, who has the right to defend itself, and bomb those terrorists. As soon as they switch and cross this border, well, suddenly they are our best friends. They're called Syrian Democratic Forces. They are groups which we embed special forces with, arm them. Never mind that our NATO ally is shelling them from across the border. Sadly, and I'll conclude with this, Henri, neither Mr. Sykes nor Picot are alive today to appreciate the transformative and magical powers the line they drew have. It's a well-known cliche that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But these borders which exist today can transform a terrorist into a freedom fighter to the same man. You just have to cross the border. And I'll end with that.
Thank you. Hawa.
Thank you very much, Harry. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me start by thanking Dr. Barham, Christine, Ahmed, Zaina, and the visible and invisible army of students and staff who helped organize this fantastic forum. As a son of Sulaimani, who was born and raised here, I'm proud to be back in Sulaimani. Thank you very much. Well, I'll talk about the view of Kurds about the post-Sykes-Picot. And let me first start by saying that in the view of Kurds in Iraq, but also in other parts or in other countries where Kurds live, Sykes-Picot century is a century of genocide, persecution, marginalization, and ethnic cleansing and chemical attacks. Well, as we have seen in the last weeks and months, even though the Sykes-Picot state system is started collapsing, but chemical attacks continue, both by Daesh, in Mahmoud and other parts, but also the genocide of Yazidi Kurds. So though the system is collapsing, but actually the core features of the system is not collapsing. I think Iraqi Kurdistan, KRG, is at a crossroads. The collapse of the current state system provides both opportunities and risks. It provides opportunities because KRG is increasingly recognized as a legitimate actor, both in the fight against Daesh, but also the presence of more than 20 diplomatic missions in Erbil, the military support, the economic support to KRG, which gives KRG a great opportunity and to capitalize on the collapse of the current state system. These are all opportunities. But at the same time, Kurdistan, KRG, faces considerable challenges. These challenges are both internal and external. And let me first begin with the external challenges, as some of the distinguished speakers talked about the fact of the difficult fact of redesigning the borders. In the case of Iraq, actually the internal borders have already been redesigned. In a way, we live in a confederal Iraq rather than federal Iraq. And the situation in Syria is also shifting. So this is in itself also an opportunity for the Iraqi Kurds. But in terms of the threats, the neighboring countries still, they oppose an independent Kurdistan. And the cost that associated with redesigning border through armed conflicts will be immense for Kurds and non-Kurds. At the same time, there are also some formidable internal challenges. First and foremost is the fragmentation and the rivalry between the main Kurdish parties in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is a fact. Yes, there is definitely a consensus, internal consensus, across the party lines about the principle of independence, but unfortunately there is no consensus on the timing and the way it has been pursued so far. And this weakens the position of Iraqi Kurds in the future negotiations with Baghdad in terms of its final status. Secondly, and this fragmentation, it has led to a political paralysis, stalemate. I will not go into details. You all know about the details of what happened over the last 6-7 months. And you've got the economic dependence, exclusive economic dependence on Turkey. Relations with Turkey has been very beneficial for Iraqi Kurdistan, but it's not just wise to be completely dependent on one country for exporting oil. I mean, this is just a common sense. You don't need to be an economic expert to have a revolutionary insight about this. Thirdly, we have the deep economic crisis, which has revealed the structural weaknesses of the system in Iraqi Kurdistan. We knew that we had paternalism, we knew that we had cronyism, we knew that we have an army of employees which get support from the government. But the crisis has revealed all these weaknesses. For all these reasons, I think what is needed from the side of Kurds to do in the coming months and years ahead is, first, what is needed is a common understanding of one joint vision and action plan about what do they want to achieve with Baghdad in the coming months and years. For this to happen, there is a need for what I call a pan-Kurdish public sphere, where different Iraqi Kurdish groups, the main groups, but also other civil society, should engage in a free and open and public debate about what do we want from future Iraq. Independence? Fine. Which kind of independence? How? And then to present this joint vision to Baghdad with the support of international community to reach a historic agreement on this. That is not the case at the moment because Kurds are fragmented more than ever. But this should be priority number one, priority number two, priority number three. And secondly, there is a need to address the structural weaknesses of the political and economic system in the region. There's also the need to address the democratic deficits of the region. You cannot ask for independence, but your parliament is paralyzed, and there is zero debate and agreement and consensus between the main parties about the way ahead and the lack of a joint action plan. And once they have reached this joint vision and action plan, it's, I think, much easier to talk to Baghdad, but also to gain the recognition and respect of the international community to support the Kurdish desire for independence. I think that day will come, definitely, but when, we don't know. But to be an independent, you need to be united. The Kurdish independence should be a cause, should be a rallying cry to unite Kurds and not to further fragment and divide them. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you. What I'll do is I'll ask very quick questions because we have approximately half an hour, although this is the last session. We can continue until tomorrow. But no, I'm going to ask quick questions before follow-up questions before I come, and I'll go to you in a minute. Robin, at one point you said the state is no longer sustainable.
I worry that the state is no longer sustainable, yeah.
Yet you heard that maybe the separation or the redrawing of the boundaries at least is objected to all the countries in the region, or at least that the adage that changing boundaries is not as easy as we think it is, and that it will create new sets of problems that we hadn't thought about. So if the states are not sustainable and you can't change the boundaries, what do you end up having?
I think there are a lot of things, a lot of ways this evolves, and it doesn't have to be automatically the breaking away of, or the division of a state, that there are lots of different ways that you accommodate depending on where you are. But I think that we've also reached a point, clearly in Syria, where I don't think that Syria is sustainable as within its current borders, and I think that impacts everything in the region around it. I think Iraq would have been much easier to hold together to guarantee its borders if it hadn't been for Syria, and I think the spillover effect is very serious. I mean, I thought Haydar was very interesting and very eloquent on that it's not going to happen. I guess I wish that it wasn't going to happen, but I just don't see. This is where I think the whole idea of what we thought was happening before the surge in Iraq, in 2004, 5, and 6, when there was so much fighting, and even the current Vice President Biden wrote a piece in the New York Times about the breakup of Iraq. And I certainly didn't share that view then, but I think we've gotten to a point that the dynamics that were defined by him and in the public debate, the policy debate about why Iraq might break up have changed completely. And that what I worry about is that the state is not sustainable because of all the internal problems it has, that the state actors are proving that they can't deliver, that the problems have become so big that they are, even if they suddenly got together and tried to find more actively, expeditiously solutions, then it's too late. And I don't know, where we are in that process, but I know I've talked to enough people here and before coming out here in the international community who are involved in this issue, that they share that concern, that we've crossed a threshold where that all the goodwill in the world, even if you could mobilize it, wouldn't get us through this crisis. And what does that mean? Does that mean automatically that Iraq breaks up? Maybe not necessarily, but it also means that the erosion is so destructive to its future that whatever the markings on a map, they don't reflect what Iraq is.
Okay, Abdulaziz, you ended up by saying that what the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia would like to see is a strong Iraq, even though we know what a strong Iraq did in the past. So let's not forget that for a moment. But let's just suppose that this is your preferred outcome. Given the realities, what is your second preferred outcome? If you can't get your number one choice, it's like in a restaurant, they don't have any more meat. What would you take? What's your second choice? What is it? I mean, we can't control events. Events are stronger than us. We can't get what we really want. What is acceptable?
In 2004, Prince Saud al-Faisal, the late Prince Saud al-Faisal, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, he said in the Manama dialogue, he said, we need to have a safe Iraq, a friendly Iran, and a prosper Yemen. So I will go for safe Iraq if I can get a strong Iraq.
But what is a safe Iraq?
Safe Iraq means a central government that is able to have a full control of its border, that can contain any domestic violences that may appear, and being able to provide welfare for the society and the people, and to have a safe border with their neighborhood.
And if that means an Iraq that is completely confederal, divided into 3, 5, 6 pieces internally, not the boundaries, but internally. Is that okay?
I hope not. Although, we've heard yesterday and maybe today some of the talk about the region, and the constitution of Iraq allowed certain provinces to create a region. If that's the Iraqi people wish, it's their decision, so they have to do that. But our concern, of course, is to have safe border with Iraq, that there is no exclusion, but there is an inclusion of everybody, and not to go through the same trouble they went through.
Excuse me. Shaban, same question. Both for Syria, especially for Syria. What's the second preference for Turkey? What is the second preference for Turkey?
If no territorial integrity, you mean?
What?
If no territorial integrity?
Right. No. You may still have territorial integrity, but you may have a confederal system. That's it. Or the option of it maybe Turkey would prefer chaos. And what I'm saying is, what is it that Turkey would like to see as a second preference, and what's the worst outcome? In a way, talking about the worst outcome helps you define what the second best is. We know what the first is. What is the second best?
Yeah. Maybe to start, I will start from what Haidar said. Curse on this side of the border, the other side of the border, because it does also relate to my answer. It's not just a Kurd crossing from the Turkish side of the border to Syria or the other way around, but what those particular Kurds do. This is also shaping the Turkish response. Until 8 months ago, last year, the Kurds on the other side of the border were treated differently than now. Also, certain Kurds inside Turkey were treated differently than today. So it's not just changing the borders, but certain actions, the support for terror and committing terror acts, that does change Turkey's response. So based on that, of course, the ideal textbook Turkish preference is territorial integrity, maybe central government control. But if it fails, I personally think that Turkey should have a kind of two-pillar policy. On the one hand, Turkey should develop accommodation with the Kurdish entity. Personally, this is my personal view. In the northern part, should find a workable relationship. But on the other hand, also the areas, especially Aleppo and northern Latakia region, the opposition FSA or other groups that have been leading the Syrian uprising from the very beginning, their control is the first, second priority for Turkey. Accommodation with the Syrian Kurds and some control on critical parts of the border by the moderate opposition groups. For that, it takes two to tango. I mean, Turkey should change some of the habits vis-a-vis the PYD in the course, but the PYD should also learn, especially the kind of language Mr. Salih Muslim used yesterday. I don't think it is helping to contribute such an accommodation between Turkey and PYD and the Syrian Kurds. So the two will have to go through some way to find an accommodation. If they fail, the third scenario, which is more chaotic, continuous Turkish security concerns emanating from northern Syria, and if also the conflict between the opposition and the regime cannot be pacified, and if the ISIS presence cannot be eliminated, it will mean another security vulnerability, because it will also mean a continuous flow of potential foreign terrorist fighters from Turkey, through Turkey from other places, their travels back to Turkey, their potential radicalization impact inside Turkey. These will all negatively impact Turkey. But in my understanding, the ideal scenario, if restoring the old order is not possible, a two-pillar policy, accommodation with the Kurds and some control of the moderate opposition in the north.
Okay, thank you. Haidar, a slightly different second best question for you. If the KRG secedes, what then? What's the best that you can fashion from an Iraq that doesn't have the KRG?
I was actually preparing an answer for the first question, which I want to come back to. But on the KRG, I mean, it's going to depend on what it looks like. Right now, from the perspective of the absolute vast majority of Iraqis, and to be brutally honest, the Shia Arabs, the notion, and this is especially the case in southern Iraq, that we have 90% or 85 to 90% of Iraq's wealth, and yet we're simply being used as a cash cow. Money is being taken from our province, and it goes to other provinces, it goes to the KRG, and there's little to show for it. And Basra, I think, according to the recent UNDP report, is the second or third most deprived province in the whole country. So you can imagine from a Basrawi point of view, the KRG constantly threatens, referendum, independence, and when you speak to them, they say, okay, go for it. Do it now. Let us stop being a cash cow and let independence happen on mutual terms, not you constantly draining our wealth and then deciding when it suits you to go to become independent. Well, on the question, Robin mentioned the notion of the nation state and how it's changing and why you think it will. How I would counter is sometimes not being clear and ambiguity actually helps Iraq. We're not sure if this city is part of the KRG or is it part of Iraq. But sometimes when you want to define the land and draw a line or put military checkpoints and say this is mine and this is yours, that's where it can get dangerous, and that's where it can complicate the equation. Of course, the elephant in the room is Kirkuk. Is Kirkuk going to be part of Kurdistan? Well, they say it's our Quds, it's our Jerusalem. But then if Iraq says, fine, take Kirkuk, how will that change the imbalance within Iraqi Kurdistan? Kirkuk is a PUK province, majority PUK. Today, would the KDP leadership really be okay with Kirkuk attaching itself to Kurdistan. But secondly, I'm not saying this is you, by the way. This is a very general comment. We should be more honest about why it isn't working. Why isn't the current system working? If it's because, as I said earlier, it's just because the Shias and Sunnis and Kurds can't live with each other, well, what do you do with the Sunnis and Shia who are in Kurdistan if it goes separate? What do you do with the Sunnis in Basra? What do you do with the Kurds and Sunnis in Baghdad? So yeah, sometimes I think, I'm not saying it works, the system is broken, but a vague, ambiguous, broken system, I think will cause less bloodshed than a, clearly defined. But on Turkey, I just want to come back on Shaban. I think it's clear Turkey prefers Daesh on its doorstep, and in fact in its own country, than the Kurds. And suddenly, when the Kurds are making very impressive gains in Syria, alarm bells start ringing in Turkey. It's a danger. And I would like to draw your attention to a report actually published by Chatham House recently. And this isn't a political, geopolitical, sectarian, Iranian-Saudi report. It's a report just looking at the economy in Syria. Turkey's trade with Syria during the course of this conflict, it reached its pre-war levels in June 2014. What else happened in June 2014? Daesh. And we're not talking money or just weapons or men, steel construction pipes, material being used to build and underpin Daesh's infrastructure, oil tankers coming and going. So I think Turkey needs to be more honest when it talks about terrorism. And then when it does fight Daesh, Turkey at the same time still funds Al-Qaeda. It still opens space for Jabhat al-Nusra, who are Al-Qaeda, who by the way are very like Daesh. The only thing they differ with is, besides the brutality, they both believe in the caliphate, just Al-Qaeda wants it to be more, or to have more grassroots support.
I feel I need to give Shaban a right to answer that before I go to Hawa. So Shaban, you have.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, here, of course, in the room, there is a lot of emotion.
No.
If I were to give other examples, there could be other kinds of emotions, so I won't. But the Turkey-Syria trade, we always spoke about it, that initially the trade dropped, later it recaptured. Thanks to many factors, not only trade with ISIS. If you reduce it to Turkey trying to rebuild ISIS, this will be quite a misleading statement. First, most of the international humanitarian assistance went through Turkey. Not only the Turkish goods or others, but many other international. Secondly, Rojava. How was Rojava rebuilt? How is it being built? How do you think Afrin survived? Where did all the goods go? From Turkey. Also other cantons, they did flourish thanks to the goods flowing from Turkey. So if you just add all the numbers and say that it is Turkey supporting ISIS, this would be quite misleading. And Turkey preferring ISIS control over its border than PYD control, I think this is again another misleading statement. Turkey, from the very beginning when the PYD declared its control, until last summer, did not take any action against PYD. It was only after Tel Abyad, and you know what happened in Tel Abyad, after Tel Abyad, and still there are 120,000 Arabs from Tel Abyad who are now living in Turkey, who are not allowed by PYD to go back to their homes. So I beg your pardon, but the story is a little bit more complicated than Turkey supports or prefers ISIS versus PYD. And then you might have seen the pictures, Turkish soldier on this side of the border, the ISIS fighter on the other side of the border. And I can also show you pictures, Turkish soldiers on this part of the border, the PKK fighter was on the other side of the border, and PKK flag Öcalan's posters. So Turkey not intervening against ISIS was more or less the same, because it was based on a concern not to get directly involved in the conflict there. But now, the Turkish action against PYD, recently, when you look at the last 2 months of conflict dynamics, it was only after PYD engaged in certain actions to manipulate the demographic dynamics of certain towns, which are not traditional Kurdish towns, either Turkmen or Arab or other groups. So if you define it, PYD expanding territory, expelling people, pulling them to Turkey as gains. Sorry, this is not gain, this is expansion, pure vulgar expansion. And if it does create security challenges, I don't think any state will just watch it.
Okay.
So it is those kind of policies that are not creating a relationship that will be sustainable and workable between Turkey and PYD. Until last summer, Turkey did accommodate, and I think in the future, the two sides will have to learn, go back to what was there before. If they, PYD continues to do the same, which was happening in the last 2 months under the Russian air cover or other actions,
But
this will create a different dynamic.
Howard, a very different question for you. Suppose, for argument's sake, that Rojava succeeds and creates, in Syria you have a federal, a confederal, very loose confederal system with Rojava under the PYD's control becoming autonomous. What kind of impact do you think it would have on the KRG? Is it completely separate? Rojava has a great deal of importance for Turkish Kurds. When you ask Turkish Kurds, what's the most important thing? All of them say Rojava. How does Rojava play here, and what impact would Rojava have on the KRG?
Right. Well, I think Rojava federalism or confederalism would be very positive for Bashur federalism. Bashur is south, for southern Kurdistan. I think it will have a positive impact. And I personally, I see the future of Kurds in these different countries. I see it like, what I call Kurdish futures and not one future. The Kurds will have, in a post-Sykes Picot, Kurds will have diverse and different futures. And there is a room for, a vision of Kurdish federalisms or confederalism, which will cooperate with each other, but also should cooperate with, with Syria proper, Iraq proper, Iran proper. And there is a room for a kind of an out-of-the-box economic and regional security framework, which would be in the interest of everyone.
Thank you. I will take a few questions. There are lots of hands. Please, please. First of all, please identify yourself and ask a question. I will, I swear to you, I will turn off whatever it is if you don't ask a question. First that lady, then I'll go to Kakha Uma, and then maybe you. And then I will continue. Yes, ma'am.
سوزان شهاب نوري عندام برلماني بيشو. I speak 3 languages, but I prefer to speak in Kurdish.
Quick question. Yeah. We're running out of time.
باش گوێگرتن لەم پانێڵە لە ڕای ئەو بەڕێزانەی کە لەوێ دانیشتووم هەستەکەم باسکردنی ئەم بابەتە ترسێکی وروژانوە لەوەی کە لەوانەیە لە ئایندەیەکی نزیکە وادەی تەواوبوونی سایکس بیکۆ و جارێکی تر ریدیزاینکردنەوەی ئەم ناوچەیە ترسێکی دروست کردووە لای هەمووان بەبێ لە لای هەمووان لەبەر ئەوەی لەسەر ئاستی ناوخۆیە ئێمە وەکو کورد جارێ خۆمان ئامادە نەکردو بەهۆی ئەو کێشانەی کە هەمانە لەسەر ئاستی دەرەوە و دراوسێ و ئەوانەی کە ئەیانەوێت تەداخلکەن لەم ریدیزاینە جارێکی تر بەبێ ویستی ئێمە جاری پێشوو کراین بە 4 پارچەوە کەس پرسی پێ نەکردین هەر هەمان کورد کرا بە 4 پارچەوە کەس پرسی پێ نەکردین هیوادارم ئەم جارە ئەگەر هات و هەر گۆڕانکاریەک بێ گەورەکان جارێکی تر پرسمان پێ بکەن و حسابمان بۆ بکەن ئەمە خاڵی یەکەم خاڵی دووەم من پرسیارەکەم ئاراستەی هەمووانە the question yes the question لە ئایندەدا پێکەوە ژیانی ئەم ڕیدیزاینەی سایکس بیکۆ باشترە لەلایەن یامانەوە لەم حاڵەتە چەق بەسوەی ئێستا کە کەسمان ئەوانی ترمان قبول نییە. حەزەکەم وڵامی ئەو پرسیارە وەرگن کامیان پێ باشترە ئایندە پێکەوە بژین هەمومان بە ئاشتی یەکتری قبول بکەین یا ئەم حاڵەتەی کە ئێستا کەسمان ئەویتر قبول ناکەین. زۆر سپاس.
Thank you. I'll take 3 questions before I get back to you. A question, sir.
جارێکی تر سوپاسی کاک بەرهەمەکەم و پانێڵەکەەوە هەموو ئەو خوشکی و برابر ڕێزانە. بەڕاستی لازم لە دوێنێەوە زۆر باسی بەهاری عەرەبی ئەکرێ و ئەمڕۆ زۆر باسی سایکس بیکۆ کرا. بەهاری عەرەبی بەڕای من زوو بوو ناوتان لێنا بەهاری عەرەبی و پەلەتان لێ کرد. بەڕای من ئەگەر ناوەکەی بگۆڕن بیکەنە پاییز شتێکی وا باشترە. دەربارەی چونکە بەهاریانی خۆشی و گوڵ و گوڵزار و هەوا و مەناخێکی خۆش ئەو شەڕێکە ئەو جەهانمەی کە لە لیبیا و لە سووریا و لە عێراق و لە یەمەنەیە ئەمە بەهارە یا جەهانمە کامێنە. لەبەرەوەم پێم وایە گۆڕن ناوەکە باشترە. دەربارەی سایکس بیکۆ لە ڕاستیەوە ئێمە ڕەنگە ڕووی خۆمان لە بەریتانیا و فەڕەنسا بکەین و دوایەوەش ئەسفەلۆن ما چونکە ئەوان وعدیان پێداین و وعدەکانیان نەبردە سەر لەگەڵمان و کۆمەڵی وعدی تێدایە. لەبەرەوە ئێمە ڕووی لەوانەکەین چۆن تێکیان داوە بۆشمان چاکەنەوە. دەربارەوەی کە سایکس بیکۆ من پێم وایە 50 ساڵە بۆتە ئەرشیف لەسەر ڕەفەدانراوە نەماوە سایکس بیکۆ چونکە سەرکەوتوو نەبووە. ئێستا گوێم لێیە 2 مانگی تر سایکس بیکۆ کۆتایی دێت. سایکس بیکۆ کۆتایی هاتووە. سایکس بیکۆ هیچ فەقەرێکی تیا نییە دوای 100 ساڵ کۆتایی دەیە کۆتایی نایە هیچ فەقەرێکی تیا نەنووسراوە. لەبەرەوە ئێستا دنیایەکی نوێیە. ئەوەی کە گوێم لێ بوو زۆر لەو بەڕێزانە بە هەندێک شتێ قبوڵیان نییە. لە دوێنەوە باسی یەکگرتو عێراقی یەکگرتو سووریای یەکگرتو ئەوانەکەن. من بەو بەڕێزاناڵێم ئێستا واقعەکە چۆنە دوای 100 ساڵ ئێستا لە کوردستان منتەقەیەکی جیاوازە لە منتەقەی سونات داعاشی لێە منتەقەیەکە لە منتەقەی شیعە منتەقەیەکە جەوشەکانیشمان جیاوازە حەچی شەعبی پێشمەرگە ئەوانی تر. لەبەرەوە من پێم وایە مەسەلەی کورد ئەبێ قبوڵ بکرێت. ئێمە کیمیاییمان لێدرا لە ناو نەچوین ئەنفال کرای لە ناو نەچین لە ناو ناچین. ئێستا قەرنی 21ەکە ئەبێ قبوڵماکەن دەراوسەیەکی باشیان بین هاوکاریشیانەکەین لە کورد دەبێت بێ بەدەوڵەتی. زۆر بە خێراتنی میوانە بیانیەکانەکەم وەکو پێشمەرگەیەک زۆر بە خێراتنیانەکەم زەحمەتیان کێشاوە هاتوون بۆ کوردستان بۆ سلێمانی بۆ ئەو پانێڵە بۆ ئەو دیداری سلێمانی زۆر بە خێربن سەرچاومان.
Question.
Azam Alwash, I'm Aidi from the south.
What do you say? What's from south?
What makes Turkey and Iran sacrosanct? If the division is going to affect Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Saudi, and Libya, if I recall Robin's article. Sacrosanct. Why?
Sacrosanct.
Why can't they be affected by division? Iran has Kurds, Baluch, Turkmen. Turkey has Kurds and Turks. Why are we only talking about the Arab autumn? Can't we talk about the entire region?
Right, so
Iran and Turkey, they're very
okay, so very quickly.
Can I just in
You
2
wanna
sentences?
Okay,
Iraq is chaotic and it's a democracy and we have to live with each other and fight and argue. Turkey is an authoritarian state. It's able to keep control with its military. Iran is a theocracy with a very strong military and it can keep the lid on it with security. Exactly. And people assume it's a false sense of stability. Eventually, it will blow up.
do anybody else? Shaban, you want to say something?
Yeah.
Quick.
We'll get that part with his Turkish as well. In Turkish we have a saying, tribünlere oynamak. He likes to, hocam siz translate it.
Was it in English? In English.
So he's speaking for the audience, not for the facts. I mean, okay, you may not like the current.
We're not going to be a Republican.
Okay.
debate.
Sorry, Henri.
Current
Sorry.
course of-
I have to get back to this because you obviously live in Turkey, and there are some things you can't say here. So don't
No,
say I cannot speak about realities.
Hey,
If you go back to Turkey,
Okay,
like
look.
Cengiz, like other Turkish
Baba.
researchers and journalists, you will go
okay.
to jail, you will go to court for insulting the Sultan.
Hey. No, okay, if anybody wants to answer the questions, I will take 2 more questions after this, which I promised. But, anything you want?
The only thing I'd say about Iran is that it's one of the few countries in the region that really wants to keep the old Sykes-Picot borders.
This gentleman and Sadiq, and that's it. I'm being told by Kak Baham that he's the boss here, so hey,
5 o'clock.
I'm just an employee.
Dr. Mohammed Ahsan, a Kurd from Kurdistan, Samaili from the south. I have just a question for Robin. Robin, do you think that after nationalism, it's inevitable that any nationalism case changes to sectarianism, tribalism, communism, localism? It's inevitable, it's normal case always in politics, or just this case exists in Arab world and Islamic world? And my question also for Sagar, it's
No, just one question. No, please, one question.
because
No.
there is one question.
One question.
Okay.
Yeah, Sadiq.
Yeah.
Say.
My name is Sadik from Turkey, a Kurdish man from Turkey. My question is to Robin Wright. Since she was the first one, as Henry said, to make a guess about 14 countries from four countries. And I personally agree that it is totally not possible to hold with the current borders anymore, unlike Al-Khohey. Now that the sky is a little bit clearer, what would be your good guess about how many countries we are going to have from how many countries? And please, if you don't give me numbers and how soon, years, your answer will be incomplete. Thank you.
I've just had a divine intervention. No. Okay, please answer those 2 questions. And you were Robin and Kawa.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, Robin, is one
it's-
also
First
Robin?
can go, and then I'll.
No. You ask your question.
Is Turkey included in the list? This is another part of the question.
Is Turkey going to do?
If Turkey's in. Okay, Kawa.
Yes. Well, Harry, I just have a comment on on the ambiguity concept of Haider. I would say what we need in Iraq is rather clarity rather than ambiguity for the future. Pre-2003, Iraq collapsed. 2003 political pact collapsed. What we need right now, for the sake of all communities, is exactly clarity, clear-cut agreements, internationally guaranteed about the rights and duties and what Iraq we need. That would help us in the future. Ambiguity will not help us anymore. Clarity. Thank you.
Robin.
Yeah, I agree. To your question, does the deterioration of nationalism apply to the whole world? Of course it does. Look at the Soviet Union. Lost Soviet nationalism and it broke up into pieces. It applies everywhere. Where you have a false nationalism, or faulty ideology, it applies any place. It's not. That's why I said the Middle East is never not an exception, and we should never try to portray it as such. In terms of your, I've got to think about that. Give me your email, and I'll think about it and let you know. But the thing about the map, and the funny story is that the New York Times had 2 URLs, one to the map and one to the story explaining it. And a lot of Turkish papers ran only the map, and it was kind of labeled Sykes-Picot Right, as if this was something that I had designed, when in fact it was the input of people throughout the region, which is, but what I tried to do in that map was to take the common denominators, the simplest ones from, you know, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And I would stick by much of what, that's the thing that surprised me. In the piece, I talked about 10 or 20 years that this was going to happen. Who would have known that it would happen within 2? And I think looking at the map the other day, by coincidence, I would stick by almost everything that I said. Abdulaziz did say to me over dinner the other night that I may have gotten Saudi Arabia wrong, that there actually may be twice as many. But
Ooh, now he's in trouble. Now he's in trouble.
She's joking.
Just one. Thank you all very much. Barham Saleh, the founding president of this university, wants to address you. And I want to thank all of you for listening and participating in this panel. And I hope we did not turn into a Republican presidential debate, but
Okay. Bet, Robin, the new Sykes-Picot right will be far more elegant. Being fashioned by you, you have a taste. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really grateful for the time we spent together. Thank you for our wonderful guests and our wonderful panelists who made this Soleimani Forum so lively, so informative. I certainly have learned a lot during the last 2 days. There were lively conversations, lively debates. I can dare and say this is unique, not only in Kurdistan and in Iraq, but is certainly across the Middle East. The level of free debate that we have had is unique. I hope this is a statement about this university, this is a statement about Soleimani, this is a statement about Kurdistan and what we aspire to be for our future. A lot of work has gone into this, organizing the Sully Forum. Members of our board deserve a lot of appreciation and gratitude for the effort that they put in pro bono to making this university work and function. Our acting president, Dr. Esther, our staff and faculty, Christine, Zaina, the staff of our IRIS department, the staff and leadership of our communication departments. I'm not going to mention names just in case if I were to miss one, because that will be unfair. A lot of people have worked on making this a success. The security services of Soleimani, who have been with us day in, day out, making sure that this will go smoothly and without interruption to city life, but also making sure that we are meeting in a secure environment, given the attention that this forum presents. So I thank the security services. I thank our Peshmergas and the Iraqi forces who are defending us and making this kind of events possible in this land where Daesh is still a threat to us. But really, my profound appreciation and thanks goes to our student volunteers who have worked hard. You know, I dabble in politics. It's frustrating working on the issues of the day with friends, but every time I come and see our students, they are inspiring. They give me the inspiration, the hope that really all what we do is not in vain. Truly, this part of the world can have a future that is decidedly different from our miserable past. We have many problems, we have many issues, we have many challenges, but at the end of the day, through dialogues and getting together, agreeing to our diversity, accepting our diversity, and tolerating our diversity is at least an important step forward. Thank you so much. Thank you to our guests who have come from afar, taken off their valuable time to be with the citizens of Soleimani, to be with our students, and offering us this wonderful opportunity. Inshallah, next year in Soleimani. We'll meet again. Thank you.